had fumbled at the lock. My pulse stilled, but my hand didn't shake. I pushed the door open with the same calmness I'd practiced my whole life. The calmness of a woman who'd survived too many storms to flinch at clouds. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, but I hadn't mopped in days. My chest tightened, then released. Whoever it was had been inside long enough to leave their scent behind. By the time I set my purse on the side table, I'd already begun counting the clues. The curtains in the living room, open wide to the fading orange light, though I always left them shut when I went out. A mug sat on the counter one I hadn't touched since Sunday, rim turned the wrong way. And then the faintest trace of perfume, that powdery floral note I knew better than my own breath. My mother's. At first I told myself it couldn't be true. But then the memory returned, sharp and unwelcome. Just that morning Mrs. Keegan from next door had waved at me across the hedge. "Oh, I saw your folks pop in yesterday," she said cheerfully. "Nice that they visit you while you're at work." I had smiled politely, but inside something had shifted. And now, standing in my own kitchen with that foreign smell clinging to the air, her words hardened into certainty. They hadn't visited. They had entered. Without me. Without permission. I stood in the center of the room, my fingers brushing the edge of the counter. A small tremor threatened to crawl up my arm, but I forced it still. Anger wasn't useful yet. What mattered was proof. I walked slowly, deliberately, like I was touring a stranger's home. The floorboards creaked differently under my shoes. Maybe it was in my head, maybe not. In the bathroom, the hand towel had been folded once instead of twice. In the bedroom, the closet door had been left ajar, just slightly, as if someone had peeked in but hadn't wanted me to notice. I opened the nightstand drawer. My spare keys lay inside the small velvet pouch where I'd always kept them. I counted. One was missing. Not misplaced, not borrowed. Missing. I closed the drawer gently, almost tenderly. My lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. More like recognition. Recognition of a line being crossed. And recognition that I already knew what to do. I didn't call them that night. I didn't storm into their house demanding explanations, like maybe a younger, more reckless version of me would have. That I brewed tea. Sat in the quiet. Let the kettle whistle until it annoyed me enough to take it off the burner. The calm was deliberate. I sipped slowly, even as my mind mapped out scenarios. If they had a key, they believed they had control. That was their mistake. Because I knew something they didn't. Something I would never tell them. My house had hidden layers. Not physical layers, not secret passages, but layers of preparation. I'd always been the kind of woman who noticed details others missed. A lamp cord fraying. A window that didn't latch tight. The world gave away its secrets if you stood still long enough to listen. And now I would listen to them. Around 9, I walked outside to water the small row of potted plants I kept by the porch. The night air was cool, the crickets loud, and the sky swollen with half a moon. Across the hedge, Mrs. Keegan was still out, fussing with her tomatoes. "You all right, dear?" she asked, peering at me. "You've been quiet this evening." I smiled, gentle and practiced. "Just tired," I said. "Long day." She nodded, satisfied, but I could feel her eyes linger. Neighbors notice more than they admit. That was another small advantage. I wouldn't need cameras outside my home, not when I had her watching without realizing she was watching. Back inside, I walked through each room again, this time deliberately leaving tiny things in place. A folded blanket on the couch, a note on the fridge, my slippers angled neatly by the bed. Markers, little breadcrumbs only I would know. If anyone stepped inside again, they'd disturb something. They couldn't help themselves. As I locked the door for the night, I let my hand rest on the knob for a moment longer than usual. The scratches gleamed faintly under the porch light filtering through the glass. That lock had told me a story, not just of trespass but of impatience. They hadn't just wanted in. They'd wanted in quickly. And that urgency, it meant something. Something I hadn't yet named. The next morning I left earlier than usual. Purposely. I placed my mug in the sink, left my slippers angled in their spot again and pulled the curtains closed. I paused at the door, heart steady. My plan was forming and patience was the spine of it. All day at work I felt a strange electricity in my veins. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. I answered emails, made copies, sat through meetings, but under it all I kept picturing my home as a stage. And sooner or later the actors would return to it. By 5 I was back in my car, the sunset painting streaks of gold across the windshield. My hands gripped the wheel firmly, my mind rehearsing what I might find. The house was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. I pushed open the door and instantly noticed it. The curtains wide open again, the blanket on the couch folded differently, and my slippers, not angled but shoved close together like someone had slid them with a foot. I inhaled slowly, deeply, almost savoring it. Proof. Solid, undeniable proof. I set my bag down, removed my shoes, and walked into the kitchen. That's when I heard it, a faint creak upstairs. My breath didn't catch. My body didn't freeze. Instead, my lips parted in that almost smile again. They were here. Still here. I moved carefully, each step measured, until I reached the bottom of the staircase. The air carried that same powdery perfume, stronger now, fresh. My heartbeat was steady, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Halfway up, another creak. A shadow moved across the thin line of light under my bedroom door. I gripped the railing, lifted my chin, and whispered to myself, "They think they own this space. But they've already lost it." When I reached the landing, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open. And there they were. The day I realized my parents had forced their way into my home without asking, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even pick up the phone to confront them. I smiled. It wasn't the smile of joy but of certainty. A quiet, sharpened edge curling across my lips. They thought they had won, that by copying my key they had slipped back into control of me, of my independence, of the space I had carved out for myself. What they didn't know was that they'd walked into the wrong woman's house. Because this wasn't just my home anymore. This was about to become a trap. The first step was the locks. I waited until Saturday morning, when the street outside was quiet and the neighbors' blinds were drawn. The sun was just beginning to rise, streaking the walls of my kitchen gold, and I stood there with a new set of smart locks in a cardboard box. They looked ordinary enough, but I knew better. These weren't just locks, they were watchers. They would record, track, and keep secrets. By 9 o'clock, every door had been replaced. The old brass knobs, the scratched-up deadbolts my parents had used, lay discarded in a plastic bag by the trash. I wiped my hands, steady and calm, and looked at my handiwork. To anyone else, nothing had changed. But I knew. Always knew. Then came the cameras. I didn't tell a soul. Not a neighbor, not a friend, not even my own sister when she called to check in later that evening. "Oh, I'm fine," I said lightly into the phone, watching the little black lens I had tucked into the bookshelf blink once before going still. The cameras were my silent allies. I placed them where no one would ever think to look. Above the refrigerator, behind the curtains, even tucked near the base of a lamp in the hallway. Tiny, unassuming but sharp-eyed. They recorded everything with perfect clarity, every whisper of movement, every unwanted hand that dared to touch what was mine. So I needed bait. That's when I set out the decoy key. I polished it until it gleamed, then placed it right on the kitchen counter as if I'd been careless, as if I had left my world unguarded. It sat there under the glow of the overhead light, ordinary to the eye, but to me it was a spark waiting for flame. I leaned against the counter that night, staring at it the way a fisherman watches a lure dance in the water. Sooner or later someone would bite. And they did. It was 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at work, seated in my cubicle with the faint hum of printers in the background, when my phone buzzed. I glanced down. The app lit up, camera feed streaming live. I tapped it open and there they were. My parents. My mother's hand, familiar in its rings and bracelets, reached for the decoy key. My father stood close behind, his shoulders stiff, eyes darting toward the door as if to check no one was watching. I could see the lines on his face more clearly than I ever had, not just the lines of age but of guilt. The key slid into the new lock. It didn't fit. That was when the house came alive. The alarms blared, sharp and merciless, shaking through the speakers I had hidden in the walls. Lights pulsed red and white, flashing like a storm. And then my voice, not my real one but the recording I had made days before, echoed through every corner of that home. "You are trespassing. Leave this house immediately." On my phone screen I watched it unfold like theater. My mother jolted, her hand flying back from the door. My father cursed under his breath, fumbling, pulling her toward the exit. The camera caught their faces clearly, not as authority figures, not as parents, but as trespassers. Caught red-handed. And I felt nothing but calm. They scrambled like children. My mother's purse strap caught on the doorknob, and for a brief second she struggled like a trapped animal. My father pulled, tugged until the strap tore free. They didn't speak. Not to each other, not to anyone. Just fled, hands shaking, eyes wide. At my desk, I crossed one leg over the other, steady as stone. To my coworkers, I was just another woman staring at her phone on her break. But inside, a tide shifted. I had turned the tables. I had taken back my house. But victory, sharp as it was, left a bitter aftertaste. That evening when I came home, I stood in the kitchen staring at the counter where the decoy key still lay, untouched now, useless. The silence of the house was heavier than ever, as if it remembered the chaos it had just performed. I ran a hand along the cool surface of the counter. My reflection stared back at me from the metal of the key. And though I should have felt triumphant, all I felt was unfinished. They had been afraid, yes. But fear fades. People recover. They would tell themselves it was a misunderstanding, or worse, they'd convince themselves they still had the right to try again. And that I could not allow. The next morning, the unease deepened. I stood by the window, sipping tea as the school bus rumbled past, and I caught sight of my mother's car parked 2 houses down. She wasn't visiting. She wasn't running errands. He was watching. Watching me. I let the curtain fall back into place, my heartbeat steady, my mind sharper than ever. If they wanted to keep playing, then I'd play too. But this time the game wouldn't just end with alarms and flashing lights. This time it would end with something they wouldn't forget. I didn't confront them that night. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask why. Confrontation was too easy. Too short-lived. Instead, I leaned into patience again. I washed dishes. I folded laundry. I smiled when the phone rang and let it go to voicemail. Because I already knew the truth. The trap wasn't over. The first act was done. The stage was set for more. And when I finally faced them, it wouldn't be as a daughter begging for boundaries. It would be as the owner of a house they could never control. Victory tasted sharp, but it wasn't enough. Fear fades, it always does. Give people a week and they'll tell themselves it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a bad dream. My parents would convince themselves they still had a right to my life, to my home. They would wait for my guard to drop. I couldn't let that happen. So I took the war into their territory. The first time I slipped their house key into my palm, it felt heavier than I remembered. Not in weight but in meaning. This wasn't just metal anymore. It was a bridge. One they had crossed first, uninvited. I was only returning the favor. The night was quiet when I parked 2 streets away, close enough to walk but far enough to keep my car unseen. It was 8:34 p.m. exactly. I remember because the church bells rang faintly from downtown, carrying on the wind like a warning. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and gasoline, the aftertaste of some neighbor's mower. Their house stood in darkness except for the faint glow of a lamp in the front room, set on a timer. I knew their patterns. I'd grown up inside those walls. I knew when they slept, when they left the television on, when my mother opened the kitchen window to let in the night air. That was my advantage. I didn't need to guess. I needed only to slip in. The lock turned smoothly. Too smoothly. My chest tightened, not from nerves but from anticipation. I eased the door shut behind me, my shoes silent on the carpet I had walked across for decades. The scent hit me instantly, lemon polish on the wooden banister, my father's aftershave lingering faintly in the hall, the old must have closed up rooms. I stood there for a long moment, letting the memories press against me like ghosts. Then I pushed them away. Tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight was about control. I didn't destroy. That would have been too obvious, too loud. Instead, I touched things softly with precision. The first object was a chair in the living room. I shifted it by just 2 inches, angled enough that my father would notice but never prove. Then the pictures, family photos on the mantel. I swapped one frame for another, my sister's graduation portrait where my parents' wedding photo used to be. In the kitchen, I rewound the clock by 10 minutes. The tick-tock continued, steady and certain, but I knew the small betrayal it carried. I flipped the calendar forward just 1 day ahead, a subtle crack in the rhythm of their week. On the table, I placed a glass of water, filled halfway, condensation dampening the wood beneath. A question with no answer. Every change was small. Every change was deliberate. And every change was mine. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. I walked down the hallway, my fingers grazing the wallpaper. It was the same pattern I remembered from childhood. Faded floral, peeling in the corners. My mother had wanted to replace it for years, but my father refused. "It's still good," he always said, as though that settled it. I smiled faintly. Even here I could unseat him. Even here I could leave behind something he couldn't control. Upstairs I opened drawers, careful to leave them exactly as I found them except for one or two details. A watch turned upside down, a scarf folded in a way my mother would never fold it. I didn't take anything. I didn't need to. By the time I was finished, I had touched nearly every room, leaving whispers of intrusion they wouldn't be able to silence. Driving home, the satisfaction sank deeper into me. But beneath it was something colder, sharper. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was making them feel the same unease they had given me. That was justice. The next morning I waited. It didn't take long. At 9:12 a.m. my phone buzzed. My mother's voice, tight and shaken, left a message. "Your father's losing things," she said. "He swears he left his watch upright, but it was turned over. And the calendar, did you? Never mind. Call me back." I didn't. By evening another message came, this time from my father. "Your mother's been moving things around again. She won't admit it, but she has. Clocks don't just change themselves. If she's losing her memory, we need to know." His tone was sharp, but I heard the fear underneath. I listened, calm, a cup of tea warming my hands. And I said nothing. The days stretched and the changes multiplied. Every time they left the house I returned. Sometimes I only touched one thing. The tilt of a lamp, the fold of a blanket. Other times I left 3 or 4 changes, each small enough to be doubted but big enough to gnaw at them. My mother started writing lists. I knew she would. I saw one pinned to the refrigerator. Curtains closed. Clock set. Shoes by the door. She wanted proof against herself. But the next day the curtains were wide, the shoes turned, the clock 10 minutes slow. My father grew restless. He checked the locks twice at night, sometimes 3 times. I watched from the street once, sitting in my car with the headlights off as he walked the perimeter of the house, flashlight in hand, jaw clenched. A man who once stood so certain in his authority, now reduced to a guard dog in his own yard. Me. I sat back and sipped my tea. But paranoia has a way of feeding itself. One night as I slipped through the back door I heard it. A creak upstairs followed by the muffled sound of voices. My body went still, every muscle coiled. They weren't out this time. They were home. I froze in the shadow of the kitchen, listening. My father's voice carried low, angry. My mother's higher, defensive. "You moved it," he snapped. "I didn't touch it," she shot back. "You always do this. Stop pretending." Their footsteps thudded above me, moving back and forth, heavy with tension. For a moment I thought they might come down, and the image of being caught there, in their home, in their trap, sent a flicker of heat through my chest. But then the voices drifted toward the bedroom, the door slamming shut behind them. I exhaled, steadying myself, and smiled in the dark. They were already unraveling. And they didn't even know I was the thread pulling loose. The next morning my mother called again. This time I answered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know what's happening in this house," she whispered. "Things are changing. Clocks. Pictures. I think your father's losing his mind." Kept my tone even, gentle. "Maybe you're both just tired," I suggested. "Stress does strange things." Pause. Then quietly, "Do you believe me?" "Yes," I said. And I did, because I knew exactly what was happening. But it still wasn't enough. The fear was there, yes. The doubt, the arguments, the sleepless nights. But fear fades. Doubt fades. I needed permanence. So I planned something more. Something they wouldn't be able to explain away. Something that would cement in their minds the truth they couldn't admit. I could feel it building, like a storm tightening in the distance. And I knew, when the lightning finally struck, they would never see me the same way again. "Who moved my watch?" My father's voice cracked through the thin walls like a whip. I almost laughed when I heard it on the recording. He wasn't asking. He was accusing. And my mother, poor woman, sounded tired. "I didn't touch your watch, Charles. Stop blaming me for everything." Her tone was defensive, but beneath it I heard the smallest tremor, that fragile note of doubt. The kind of doubt that grows like mold in the corners of a mind. I sipped my tea slowly, the porcelain warm in my palm, and smiled. It had taken only days for the cracks to show. My mother swore she heard footsteps at night, soft and deliberate, crossing the upstairs hallway when she knew my father was already asleep. She whispered it to him like a confession, her voice trembling, but instead of comfort he snapped at her. You imagine things. You always have. Yet the very next evening, I watched on the camera I'd hidden in their hall closet as he climbed out of bed in his pajamas, flashlight in hand, creeping from room to room. His jaw was tight, his breath heavy. He checked the locks, pressed against the windows, tested the doorknobs. And I knew he didn't believe her, but he didn't believe himself either. I returned often, each time carrying with me a quiet storm. I didn't need to overturn furniture or smash plates. No. I only needed to move with the same precision I had before. A book from the left side of the shelf to the right. A coat folded differently on its hook. A photograph tilted just enough that the eyes inside no longer looked straight. Each change was small. Harmless if you believed in accidents. But I knew accidents couldn't explain them all. And soon they knew it too. Their world had become a riddle with no answer. And I was the hand writing it. The recordings showed me what they never would have admitted out loud. My mother pacing the living room at 2:17 a.m., muttering prayers under her breath. My father staring at the kitchen table, fists clenched as if he could will the glass of water I left there into vanishing. The two of them whispering in corners, their voices sharp and low, using words like curse, thief, and once I laughed at this one, ghost. They didn't know the truth. I was the ghost haunting them. And yet sometimes it was almost too easy. One night I watched my mother stand in the doorway of the den, her hands shaking. Charles, she whispered, the clock? It's wrong again. I said it, I swear I did. It's 10 minutes behind. His response was a bark. Then you're losing your memory. Stop blaming me. You can't even keep track of your own kitchen. The sting of his words landed and I saw her flinch. From my own kitchen miles away, the steam rising from my teacup, I whispered softly, good. But paranoia spreads like a sickness. Soon they weren't only doubting each other. They were doubting themselves. My mother scribbled notes in a shaky hand, leaving them on countertops, tucking them into drawers, curtains closed. Clocks set. Shoes placed. I saw them all on the recordings. Proof she was desperate to defend herself against her own mind. But every note became another weapon in my hands. If she wrote shoes by the door, then I turned one just slightly. If she wrote curtains closed, then I left them wide open to the night. If she wrote clock set, then I rewound them by exactly 10 minutes again. Her lists betrayed her. And I betrayed her through them. My father, on the other hand, took a different path. He began locking the same doors 3, sometimes 4 times a night. I watched him circle the house from the outside, flashlight beam cutting across the lawn like a warning signal, his breath puffing in the cold. At one point he even tested the smoke detector, his frustration mounting. If something happens, he muttered, voice caught by the hidden microphone, we'll know it's real. But he didn't know that I was the smoke. Invisible until I chose to choke him. It wasn't only their home unraveling, it was their marriage. The recordings caught it all. Stop moving my things, he shouted one evening, his face red, his fists slamming the table. I didn't touch them, my mother cried, tears streaking her cheeks. I don't even know what's happening anymore. You've lost your mind. No, maybe you have. The silence after that exchange was heavy. They sat in different rooms for hours, the tension hanging like a storm cloud ready to break. And I sat at my own table, spoon tapping the rim of my cup, savoring every drop of their collapse. Yet even in the sweetness of victory, a darker thought began to creep into me. Was I only haunting them, or was I beginning to haunt myself? Sometimes late at night when my own apartment was quiet, I swore I heard footsteps too. A creak in the floorboards. A faint shift in the air. I told myself it was just the old building settling. But part of me wondered, once you start living like a ghost, do you ever stop? One evening my mother's voice cut through the recording like broken glass. I saw her, she whispered. My breath caught. Saw who? Her eyes were wide, darting, her hands twisting in her lap. At the top of the stairs. A shadow. A woman's shape. My father scoffed, but I heard the doubt crack in his voice. You're losing it. But my mother leaned forward, her voice trembling. No, Charles. Someone's here. I know it. For the first time I felt a flicker of unease. She was closer to the truth than I had ever allowed. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the glow of my phone screen lighting my face as I replayed her words over and over. I saw her. Had she? Or had her mind conjured me out of the dark? Either way, it didn't matter. The effect was the same. The next day I went back to their house. This time I didn't just shift a chair or tilt a frame. I left something bolder. In the hallway mirror, with the faintest trace of my fingertip, I drew a single line. Barely visible, but there. The kind of mark you'd swear was nothing, until you noticed it again and again. Something unmistakably human. When I watched the recording that night, my mother gasped the moment she saw it. "Charles," she whispered, clutching his arm, "tell me you see it. Tell me you see it too." And for the first time he didn't dismiss her. He froze. His eyes locked on the mirror, his jaw stiff. "I see it," he said. A silence followed, heavy and raw. And then slowly he turned his head, looking straight into the hidden camera I had planted, though of course he couldn't know it was there. But the way his eyes narrowed, the way his body stilled, it was as if he sensed me. As if he knew someone was watching. I leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding in my chest. For the first time, the game didn't feel one-sided anymore. The hunter might have been seen. "My key doesn't work anymore." That was how my father began, his voice brittle, cracking like a branch under too much weight. He stood in the frame of my doorway, hands still curled around the useless brass that no longer belonged to him. I looked at him and I didn't answer right away. The hallway light behind him buzzed, flickering faintly, throwing his shadow long and thin across my floor. His tie was loosened, his collar wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights. For a man who had once strutted through life certain of his authority, he suddenly looked very small. And yet he tried. "You changed the locks," he said, though it came out more as a question. I let the corner of my mouth twitch upward. "Of course I did." Behind him I caught the sound of a quick intake of breath. My mother hovered at the bottom of the stairs, her frame shrunken, her hands twisted together as though she could wring clarity from the skin of her own knuckles. When his voice faltered, hers rose in a whisper. "We only wanted to check on you." The lie was almost tender. Almost. I turned my gaze on her, sharp as glass, and let the silence stretch until it pressed heavy in the air between us. "You wanted control of me," I said at last, calm, even unshaken. "And now you have no control of yourselves." The words landed. I could see it in the way my father's shoulders tightened, his jaw grinding. He wanted to argue, needed to, perhaps, but every phrase that reached his tongue seemed to dissolve before he could shape it. His hand dropped the useless key into his pocket, and the faint jingle as it landed sounded hollow, defeated. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he muttered, though he didn't look me in the eye. But I did know what I was doing. And I had been doing it for weeks. He just didn't understand that I was 3 steps ahead always. The air inside my apartment felt still, almost too still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The faint smell of lavender drifted from the candle burning on the table, sweet and deliberate, chosen for calm, but it only made the tension sharper. I crossed the room slowly, my steps steady, my pulse steady too. It wasn't courage that carried me, but the certainty of someone who already knew the ending. "You came here thinking you could confront me," I said softly, "but you've already lost." He bristled, the old bluster flashing for just a moment. "Don't talk to me like that." I tilted my head. "Like what?" "As if you're not the one standing in my doorway, powerless." His throat bobbed, his voice catching on the words he wanted to throw at me but couldn't. Because he was powerless. He felt it. And worse, he knew that I knew it. My mother stepped forward then, her shoes tapping lightly on the wooden floor. She reached out a hand, hesitant, shaking. "Please," she murmured. "This isn't who we are. We just want peace." I cut her off. Her lips closed, her voice swallowed. I let the pause linger, then finished the thought for her. "You'll never find it here." I could see her fingers flutter toward the lock behind her, almost unconsciously. She twisted the deadbolt shut with a sharp click, as if sealing us together in the same room would change something, as if a lock could mean safety when she no longer trusted locks at all. Her own hands trembled afterward. For a moment no one spoke. The sound of the candle flickering filled the silence, a tiny hiss every time the flame bent under a draft. Outside, a car passed, headlights flashing across the curtains like a searchlight, gone in an instant. I studied them both. My father rigid, his shoulders tight, trying to mask fear with authority. My mother fragile, eyes darting, clinging to the illusion of control she never had. And me calm, balanced, watching them crumble. You don't understand what you're doing, my father tried again. But this time his words were softer, almost pleading. I smiled, a small, deliberate thing. I understand perfectly. And I did. Every shift of theirs, every misstep, every anxious glance. I had orchestrated all of it. I had turned their own lives into a labyrinth of doubt. And now they stood before me not as parents, not as authority, but as trespassers who had already been caught. His hand twitched at his side, curling briefly into a fist before relaxing again. I noticed. You think this is victory, he said, his tone low. But it isn't over. I met his stare, unblinking. It is for you. My mother touched his arm then, her voice breaking. Charles, please, stop. It was the first time she'd used his name in weeks, maybe months. Normally it was he or you. Now suddenly it was personal. Intimate. As if even she could see he was slipping too far into something he couldn't win. He pulled away from her touch. I leaned against the edge of the table, folding my arms, every movement deliberate, calm, unhurried. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to break anything. I only needed to let you see yourselves clearly. And now finally you do. My mother shook her head, her eyes wet. No, that's not true. We only. I cut her off again, my voice firm but quiet. You crossed a line. And for the first time, you realize you can't step back. The words hit like a final verdict. I watched them both flinch, not from noise, not from violence, but from the weight of truth. That was my weapon. Not a key, not a camera, not even the lock they couldn't open. It was truth. And it silenced them more than anything else ever could. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound sharp as a metronome marking the rhythm of their defeat. For a long while they said nothing. My father's chest rose and fell unevenly. My mother's gaze dropped to the floor as if afraid to meet my eyes again. Finally, I let the silence break. You wanted control of me. Now you have no control of yourselves. It was my final line, the one that sealed everything. I watched my father's face tighten, watched his mouth open and close without words. He looked for a retort, but none came. My mother's hand hovered near the door again, hesitant, as if her only instinct was to escape. And that was when I knew they finally understood. But before they left, my father stepped closer. Just one step. His shadow stretched across the floor, merging with mine. I'm not afraid of you, he said, but his voice trembled. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to a whisper. Then why are your hands shaking? The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. My mother fumbled with the lock, finally turning it, the sharp metallic click echoing through the room. She pulled him back, her voice sharp with urgency. Enough, Charles. Let's go. He resisted for a moment, his eyes still on mine. But eventually he stepped backward. One step, then another. And as the door opened, cold air rushing in, I held his gaze until the last possible second. For the first time they understood the line they crossed. And for the first time they realized they could never step into my space again.